All of you, welcome. Thanks very much. Much to delve into, but let me start with you first, Ben. You did a piece of research last year about BRA, a very deep piece of research, but do you get a sense that the UK's position on BRA has changed post some sort of resolution of the Brexit discussions?
I don't really see much of a change, to be honest. I think the driving line is still pretty much the same as it was at the inception of after the referendum. That the aim is to move closer to China, particularly with the longer-term vision of signing some form of free trade agreement. I think that's the driving angle has been that for the past couple of years. Since Brexit, I think obviously now there's a bit more momentum towards that since the referendum and the ultimate implementation of Brexit has taken place. So that gives, I think, the British government a bit more of a clearer path to pursue that particular objective. But I think that ultimately there hasn't been that much of an evolution since the referendum has taken place.
Okay. Ms. Margaret, have you sensed anything post the election? Has China sensed more enthusiasm from the UK about that road?
Which election?
Let's see. Let's go back to the most recent one. The most recent one. And then we can ask post-cabinet reshuffle, but that's another story. So.
First of all, of course, I appreciate that actually the British business is very much interested in the BIR initiative. And the British government also hugely supportive. I think following the last election in December, the UK government is ready to sort of restart the China-UK relations. I see good momentum on the part of both sides to continue to promote China-UK cooperation. I think that includes our cooperation on the Belt and Road Initiative. Actually, even if between elections, China-UK were talking about the Belt and Road Initiatives, and like CBBC and the KMPG, they have published many reports on how to promote partnership between China and UK businesses and all sectors, actually.
But there was a capacity issue with UK government over the last 6-8 months in particular. Mary, let me turn to you. Do you think that there's now an opportunity to reboot the UK's work on enthusiasm for BRI?
Yeah, I think that one of the dimensions of it, which I think ought to be brought to higher profile, is the importance of any international connection of that sort and the power it has for growing people and developing skills and building much more of a global mindset in populations right along the whole stretch of the Belt and Road. And I think that there is actually quite a lot happening already, which is where the University of Nottingham took a pretty inspired lead when it set up its campus in Ningbo, well over a decade ago, and also before that its campus in Malaysia. But of course, it's other higher education institutions and schools, indeed, in the UK that have lots of Chinese students. So we have quite a lot of flows going already, and it may be post the election, and we have the headlines of the new immigration rules yesterday, which was a kind of significant issue to bear in mind in this, because I do think it's really important we allow our emerging new generations to interchange and travel and learn in different contexts. Because I know from my own experience that when you have done that with young people in their late teens, early 20s, and indeed later in life too, but particularly at that time, you build a connection that's there for life. And it's a very, very powerful part of the way we're going to make all of this work, because we need to have people who are cross-cultural, who are fluent in moving around. So I think to build in a people perspective to our discussions, I think is a really important one.
Stephen, does it come down to, if we had to sum up the Belt and Road issues, geopolitics and the concerns around that versus the commercial opportunities?
Well, the geopolitics matter, and they matter perhaps more than people might have expected 10 or 15 years ago. So if we went back 10 or 15 years and thought about the pros and cons of Brexit, the obvious pro was the idea that if we left the EU, we'd be free to do trade deals with countries all over the world. but it helps in trying to achieve that ambition to know that the countries all over the world are talking to each other so they can all talk to the UK. And that's become a slightly more awkward position in recent times. I'm an economist, although I stress I'm not a super forecaster, just in case you're wondering, there's a distinction between the two. And I was looking just recently at the UK's most important export market. Now, admittedly, this is for goods, not services. But in terms of Britain's most important export markets, in the top 10, 8 are in Europe. Only one of those in Europe is not in the EU, which is Switzerland. And the other 2 are the US, which is number 1, and China, which is number 8. So in a post-Brexit world, it's really important that we ideally build relations with both the US and China. But the UK's capacity to do that depends not just on the UK's bilateral relations with each of those 2 countries, but obviously it matters in terms of those 2 countries' relations with each other. And I fear that relationship is one that frankly makes the UK's trajectory in the future more problematic than it might previously have been. Now, I was at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum both this last year and in 2018, and Hank Paulson, the former US Treasury Secretary, spoke at both of those fora, and his line was that he feared that there was a possibility of a new economic iron curtain descending across the world. And I think it is important not to lose sight of some of the political realities that have emerged in recent times. 20 or 30 years ago, I think you could characterize American attitudes towards China as being attitudes of engagement. You know, the idea would be that if the US could engage with China, China would become richer, wealthier, and perhaps would begin to change itself politically in some way or another. Today, the language you hear in the US is not just from the Trump administration, it's from Congress more broadly. It's all about the idea not so much of engagement, but of containment. And it's not clear what the Americans mean by containment, but I think it's a radically different approach to how US-China relations evolve, which in turn makes it more difficult for countries elsewhere to establish good relations with both at the same time.
Douglas mentioned that the UK could play a role in leading the debate, the impartial, objective debate based on facts about Belt and Road. But it is a vexing issue, is it not, the current tensions between the US and China and how that could play out or impact the UK's role?
I think probably you need another forum to discuss China-US relations. I find it a bit troublesome for the United States, especially the administration, to adopt a negative attitude towards China, especially those talk of containment or talk of decoupling. How can we decouple from each other? Especially, between China and the United States. We are so interlinked. And the present relationship between China and the United States was so different from the Cold War era, where the United States and the Soviet Union didn't quite trade. But now, China and the United States were so linked together. To decouple from China is to decouple from opportunities of working with China. I really think that the American population, especially the American administration, might need to do sort of soul-searching on their policies towards China. This is the time that we need to work together, prosper together. And actually, that's the aim of Belt and Road Initiative, is let us work together, cooperate and prosper together in a globalized world. So BRI is like a global China, as you talk about global Britain. So it's a good thing that we should do it together.
But there's no doubt the US has been lobbying its allies very strongly to not engage with BRI and has been sending out some very strong messages along those lines. Do you see any slowdown in momentum for BRI projects or an increase in enthusiasm in the UK in this environment?
Towards the BRI?
Yeah.
I think that there's, obviously now there's going to be a regeneration of enthusiasm towards the BRI. I don't actually think that the US-China political tensions will have that much of an impact on how the UK will approach the BRI, because there's clearly a desire for engagement to want to work with China, to want to help improve the BRI as a global public good. The US, I think that what's important for the UK is also to help promote healthy competition for the Belt and Road Initiative as well, because we can't just rely on one form of infrastructure financing, particularly for developing countries who are attracted to the Chinese model of infrastructure financing and development. And it's going to be up to the UK to help support initiatives which come also from the US, which is seeking to promote its own version, which might be seen as competing, but also initiatives coming out of Japan, the European Union, Australia and Canada, and those synergies which are already existing amongst those particular actors as well. I think also where the UK can clearly play a role is with regards to building capacity, as Sir Douglas Flint mentioned, but in terms of working with local actors. So, the one thing about the Belt and Road Initiative is often foreseen as coming out of Beijing as a monolithic, well thought out strategy implemented on the ground to meet political objectives. But actually, the Belt and Road Initiative is quite disaggregated in terms of how it works. Even within China, it's provincial actors who are often leading the role here. But where the UK probably needs to play a role is in terms of helping local decision makers from recipient countries make well-informed decisions in terms of the projects they really need on the ground. I think the UK can definitely play a role there.
Well, there's a point that that Douglas said this is a China-led initiative, not a China initiative, and the UK's role could be, for want of a better term, possibly, I want to misquote you, almost broker. Is that the role that the UK should aspire to?
I think that Douglas is absolutely right. There's an opportunity here for partnership, and Ben just said the important thing is that you allow people along the route as well to be part of the partnership. I think but you need to have some push behind it, which I think the whole way it has developed in principle has suggested that, and I very much welcome the strong link to the SDGs too, because I think if we don't all build the Sustainable Development Goals into everything we do, whoever we are, wherever we are in the world, we're never going to achieve them. So that is an important supporting theme to it. But absolutely, you've got to have partnerships all through. But I take Stephen's point about the difficulty of how these partnerships work when the multilateral nature of them are not all moving in the same direction. And that complicates it, because if people's motivation or expectation is contradictory, then you can waste a lot of energy on it. So I think people are going to have to be quite tactical about how we build it in the most productive way.
Stephen, is there a risk the UK is overstating its negotiating power in the post-Brexit world?
I'm not sure if we've overstated it. I think people do wonder how much negotiating power we have on the basis that we are very much in need of doing deals with countries elsewhere in the world, and those other countries are not quite so needy of doing deals with the UK, so there's an element of a begging bowl out there in terms of what the UK can possibly achieve. But if I may, I wanted to go back to something that Douglas very wisely said, because he had some very good coaching over the years, of course, in economics. And it was about this distinction between finance and economics, because I think that it's actually a really crucial distinction, and it matters with regard to the underlying politics of Belt and Road. And perhaps one way to illustrate this is to think about the rules-based systems that existed in other parts of the world, whereby everything is incredibly transparent, but still things went eventually wrong between the creditor nations and the debtor nations. I'm thinking obviously of the Eurozone. The rules-based system worked perfectly well, but ultimately there was a political question, which is that when there was if you like, a collective economic shock, when outcomes were significantly worse than everyone had expected, the ultimate question was, who pays for that? Is it the creditors of, say, Germany, or is it the debtors of, say, Greece or Spain? And we know what the answer is. It was the debtors of Greece and Spain. And one of the lessons from the Eurozone crisis is that the debtor countries have chosen themselves to become increasingly creditor countries. They've moved into balance of payment surplus. It was exactly the same conclusion that many Asian countries reached after the Asian crisis in 97, 98. So I think one big question here is not so much what are the rules of engagement during the good times when China provides credit to another country, but in the event that the economic expectation is different from what everyone had previously expected, when things go wrong, who picks up the pieces, who pays the bill when things go wrong, and to what extent is that a threat to the sovereignty, both political and economic, of individual countries? Because there's no doubt that in Greece's case, its own sovereignty was hugely undermined as a consequence of the crisis. No one expected that to happen, but it did happen. So I think even when you've got a rules-based system, there are still some big political questions out there as to what happens in the event of periods of intense stress.
Yeah, Ben, did you find any of that in your research, concerns about the debt trap issue and the risk to sovereignty?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the debt trap issue was slightly blown out of proportion in the sense that there was a political agenda behind it as well. But the research does show that there are some countries clearly, which might not matter tremendously for the global economy. We're talking about, for example, Djibouti, which has exposed itself in terms of debt, not only accumulated debt, but also from one single creditor being emanating out of China. So that's where there is that importance of needing to work with local actors to make sure that they also take this into consideration, raising awareness of becoming overly dependent on one single source of financing as well. And I think probably the most famous case is often brought up is that of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, of a piece of poor financing or poor decision making. But actually, when you look at the details of the origins of the decision making behind that, you see again that it was more of a political calculation made on behalf of the Sri Lankan side and also the Chinese state-owned company, which was pushing for that deal too. So I think that if you talk about the role of the UK, yes, it would be a third-party actor in this regard, but it still has that expertise and the contacts in order to help, simply raise awareness amongst a variety of different local actors, not just political, but also civil society driven as well.
Ms. Mother, the debt trap's often cited as one of the reasons why there should be scepticism or concern about getting involved. China's recalibrated its position. Is there a recognition that this is something that China should do its best to avoid?
No. Sometimes I feel that some people are not doing anything practical, but are good at inventing traps. So many of them nowadays. As Ben said, the issue of so-called debt trap is very much, it's a non-issue because China is very much a latecomer in terms of providing loans. We used to borrow a lot of loans. We didn't say any other foreign country put China into debt trap. And China was a latecomer. China only went global in the past few years, maybe a decade. So actually it was the European banks or American banks or the international banks that have provided most of the credit to most of the developing countries, including Sri Lanka, including Pakistan, because the statistics from the Central Bank of Sri Lanka is China's loans is only 10% of their international foreign loans.
But there is a particular port where there was a particular issue, which threw the spotlight very much on Belt and Road projects.
Yeah, this port, actually, it was made very clear that it was a difficult negotiation, result of difficult negotiation between China and Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka side proposed that they would like China to run this port in such a way. At the initial beginning, the Chinese company didn't want to do that actually. So, but finally they decided and they negotiated a deal. But to China, it is very clear. After some time, when it's the sovereignty or the ownership of the port belongs to Sri Lanka, and if Sri Lanka wanted it back, they can buy back the shares. Then it's theirs, because now it's a joint venture. Chinese companies set up a joint venture with two Sri Lanka companies running the port. So if the Sri Lanka side wanted it back, they can have it back by buying back the shares. Obviously, there are a lot of issues relating to financing.
Yes.
And as I said, this is a new issue. This is a new initiative. So it takes a lot of efforts to improve. That's why we're talking with the UK. That's why we have this AIIB, and we have a new multilateral financial center in cooperation with the AIIB, ADB, and the ERBD and the World Banks. So if we have a multilateral financing regime to finance a project, a BRIB project, maybe it works better. But because the BRI was China's initiative, so China has to play the leading role, at least at the very initial beginning. But China cannot provide all the loans that is needed for infrastructure development. So we needed the help, contribution from other countries, from other lending organizations. But we can discuss, consult, work out best form that work well for the recipient country. Obviously, China's aim is for the recipient country to prosper, and it was not our intention to put them into debt. I think some of the countries who are investing, who provided loans to Africa, should think again, have your loans helped Africa? While what China is doing is to help Africa to grow, to stand on their own by putting investments into long-term infrastructures. It is not only a railway, but the railway could also grow with an industrial and a trade zone where there are Chinese businesses or foreign businesses invest. So it's a comprehensive prosperity plan. As Ben said, it's a public good thing. It's not China's geopolitical tool. So the BRR shouldn't be viewed too much or solely from a geopolitical point of view. First of all, it's an economic and trade initiative. Let's do it together. It's a globalization project.
Okay. I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions, please. I want to ask one more, but I'll come to you in just a moment. One more to you, Stephen. Douglas more than touched on it, focused very much on the UK's role in capital markets and developing infrastructure as an investable asset class. That's the golden prize, is it not?
Yes, it is. And it is actually something which is really quite challenging in some ways. So one of the problems with infrastructure is that once it's built, it's kind of there, it's stuck there, you don't move it around. And once you build a railway, once you build a port, it's there. And one of the issues for private investors throughout history is that there's always a danger that governments, once the infrastructure is built, will regulate to ensure that the price that people pay is the marginal cost of producing the service rather than covering the total cost of the investment in the first place. You go back to the 19th century and you think about the railway boom in the 1840s in the UK. It was great ultimately for consumers of rail products, but for the investors themselves it was a bit of a disaster. Same is probably true for the Channel Tunnel, frankly. It was a great thing for the point of view of Britain, but in terms of investors, probably wasn't so good. So one challenge actually in terms of getting private money into Belt and Road, this is not specifically for China, it's for anyone who's involved. So, okay, investing in infrastructure, economically, socially, absolutely desirable, but trying to find a way to ensure that the investors who put the money in get some kind of return. That, I think, is still quite a significant challenge. It's a challenge not just in terms of the practicalities of things, but it's also a challenge in terms of trust, history, and all the things that have been associated with failed infrastructure projects in the past. Okay, let's open up now to questions, please. Just put your hand in the air, we'll bring around a mic. And just behind you, Lord Howe.
David Howe from the House of Lords. By the by, just before my question, after Sir Douglas's superb speech, I have tried to do my best over the Chinese interest in Macclesfield, the great silk town. But I did find that there was a certain local resistance or apprehension, mainly on the thought that the burghers of Macclesfield were worried that it would all lead to a vast increase in Chinese tourism. So there are problems there. Perhaps they can be overcome, and it's a lovely idea, but that's what it's all about. I also just quickly say, Sir Douglas mentioned the Eurotunnel. As I was Transport Secretary at the time, I can confirm that Number 10 and the Treasury were resolutely against the whole project. Absolutely. They fought it tooth and nail. I had to visit Mr. Fitterman, the French Transport Minister in Paris, secretly in order to keep alive our interest at all. So we eventually got it. So maybe it's time to split the Treasury, and Mr. Cummins is right about that. My question is this, really. I've heard Chinese sources say again and again that the financing of the various PRI projects is going to depend on the development and exploitation of hydrocarbon fossil fuel resources, mainly gas and oil. I just wonder how that squares with the broad global ambitions for climate change and emission reduction, and to what degree that is a reality that they can rely to finance on that particular source. It seems to me there's some contradiction there that needs clarifying.
Lord, thank you very much. That's a very good question. I'll come to you, Minister Marsh. How does one square environmental issue sustainability with the demand for fossil fuels around Belt and Road projects?
Life is full of contradictions. I once went to the House of Lords and I had a discussion with Baroness who really complained to me that China is very much short-sighted in investing in thermal power in Pakistan. My question was there any power plant in Pakistan? The answer was not. So what we were doing in Pakistan was helping Pakistan relieve or reduce the power shortage. So obviously you have choices, but in the meantime, what China was doing, I was told, like the Qasim power plant, it was up to the best environmental standards. It is a thermal power plant, but it is up to the best environmental standard. So what we try to do is try to have the best of two worlds, but ideally, in our real life, you can never have the best of two worlds. So, but China, it is very clear for China that we want to build a so-called green Belt and Road. We don't want to pollute the world. We don't want to so-called export pollution while we help other countries develop. So we will keep in mind environmental protection, environmental standards, fighting climate change is equally important. So we will implement the strictest environmental standards, even if we are helping build thermal power plants. So that's very important.
Douglas, I think you alluded to that in this environment, while the investments might not be as green as one might, they're probably greener than they would have been otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think we should give credit for the opportunity benefits. So if we build a gas-fired power station when it would have been a coal-fired power station, that's a win. If we build a cleaner gas station than a dirtier one, that's a good thing. I mean, getting everyone onto solar renewable power at the first instance is just not practical. So I think it's the marginal benefit. And as the Minister said, you know, the big challenges, one is climate change, one is economic inequality, and so on. If you have a failed nation on your doorstep, or a failed nation that can export its citizens looking for the opportunity that we all expect, it may well be worth having a power station that isn't absolutely renewable to give people an economic future that solves a much bigger problem. As the Minister said, there's lots of contradictions and conflicts.
Yeah. Ben, did you find that in your research, the sort of greening of Belt and Road initiatives is an aspiration, but might be more complicated to implement?
I think it's clearly an aspiration, but and the Chinese government has set standards, also developed, set this up as a key topic for discussion in various fora related to the BRI. But in terms of the early projects, I'm not sure whether that was really the priority. I think the priority for the Chinese government, first and foremost, is to help create opportunities for its companies overseas. Now, whether that takes into consideration climate change or not, I don't think that the early projects took that into consideration. But now we're here, there is the chance to help further green projects. And
it certainly sounds more part of the discussion, the narrative now, the green project.
Now it is, yeah. In terms of how that will work out in the implementation, is still there to be seen.
Okay.
I think it's a good area where the relationship across the globe between research and academic institutions and the research into green energy in particular is really important. And I think I'm right, I can be corrected if I'm wrong, but I think that the zero carbon building at the Ningbo campus in China that Nottingham chose to do at an early stage of its development of that campus to demonstrate the importance of renewable energy. This was some time ago that building went up. So the first zero carbon China through an academic partnership. So we need to do more of that.
Okay. Steve?
I just have one little thought on this.
Sure.
And actually it's more to do with, funny enough, mobile phone technology. You can jump from one technology to another relatively swiftly if you choose to. And what I mean by that is that if you're a country that didn't have landlines at all, you wouldn't put landlines in. You go straight to mobile phone technology. You have masts of one sort or another. And it's certainly true that in the 20th century, a lot of countries that were dependent on coal shifted to oil and gas. It was the next stage of development. But I do wonder, and I don't want to sort of be too controversial here, but I do wonder whether it's possible to shift from coal directly to renewables and miss out the oil and gas stage to a certain degree. That there maybe we have the huge productivity gains we've had in terms of solar panels, for example, in recent times, suggests that it may be a greater possibility today to do these kinds of things than might have been the case 10, 20, 30 years ago. In exactly the same way that there are parts of the world you'd happily put in mobile phone masts and wouldn't even dream of putting in what you might describe as old technology. So I just wonder whether there could be the green initiative could be slightly greener than it actually is currently.
Okay. Martin, you want a question? And then I'll come to you straight after.
Thank you very much. Martin Hatfull with CREAB, a public affairs company. We've talked a lot about so far about the UK's approach to Belt and Road, either in terms of our relationship with China or in terms of the global good opportunity of building infrastructure as an asset class. I'd like to pick up a bit more on the point which Ben touched on about the importance of our engagement with the Belt and Road in terms of developing our relations with the rest of Asia. Because in a post-Brexit world, this is critically important, as is indeed, of course, our relationship with China and US and lots of other countries, but certainly Asia as a whole. And I wonder whether we're paying enough attention to, as it were, mobilizing our engagement with the Belt and Road as part of the development of our and consolidation of our relations with important countries who are Belt and Road partners and beneficiaries.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of work to be done there. If you look at if you take Southeast Asia, it's probably, if we're talking about the Maritime Silk Road, was originally designed for ASEAN member states. And actually, if you take a country like Malaysia, it's been one of the most active on the Belt and Road Initiative. But now itself is starting to realize that perhaps there were some decisions which are taken of a political order which did not really sufficiently account for financial added value. So when Dr. Mahathir became Prime Minister in 2018, he first said that he wanted to cancel some of the ongoing BRI projects in Malaysia. Although now it's renegotiation and the East Coast Railway line is construction will start. So I think here, obviously, the UK, it doesn't seem to have been a priority for the British government, of course, because Brexit took centre stage. But the UK government has the networks, has the leverage and long-standing historical relations with certain countries in the Asian region, which means it has a position in order to help with the capacity building and advice to promote the global public good of the BRI, because of course Southeast Asia is a part of the world where the demand for infrastructure, new infrastructure or regeneration is incredibly high, and that will not change in the short term.
Yeah, please.
I think there is huge scope for China and the UK to work together on developing the so-called third-party markets. And UK used to be the British Empire, where you embrace so many countries and regions, and you maintain traditional relations with many countries all over the world, in Asia, in Africa. So China and the UK can work together in exploring this market. Actually, during the 10th EFD, the Economic and Financial Dialogue, China and UK signed an agreement on developing the third-party markets. So we should work together. Actually, I understand that our embassies to African countries actually talk to each other from time to time, try to identify some projects where China, UK, we can work together, where you can play to your advantage of expertise. I read that in projects in Europe, in Montenegro, there is a wind power station. Actually, a UK foundation or fund helped in. So it's China, Maltese, Montenegro, and the UK. It's a four-side project. And in Bangladesh, we are developing a gas plant. I think UK also had a role, or already is playing a role. So let's work together in Asia, in Africa, the partnership for investment and growth in Africa. So under those framework, China and UK can work together, help each other, play into each other's advantages.
Sure.
First of all, I wanted to congratulate you on your wonderful diplomatic skills. I think the idea of describing the British Empire as Britain embracing other countries is a very polite way.
Yeah, I was going to think about picking that up, but let it
My
slide.
English was not
Let it
good
slide.
Very impressed. But actually, I just thinking about ASEAN and countries in Southeast Asia, I think there's been a habit where sort of geopolitical divisions begin to come in. There's been a habit of thinking, well, either they're with China or they're with the US, and there's nothing in between. And I think, interesting, whenever you think of Duterte, The Philippines has put itself in a slightly peculiar position. There are clearly sovereign disputes with China in terms of various aspects of land. But equally, Duterte, when he came into power, the first place he went to was Beijing and wanted to do trade deals and recognised that actually there was a stronger relationship to build with China than had been the case in the past. And of course, he himself has rather cooled in terms of his relationship with the US over the same period of time. So whatever the sort of divisions we tend to think of as being permanently existing in parts of the world, those divisions are much hazier than we often think they are. And I think you're right, that's where China and the UK can work together to build places where perhaps the UK might be trusted to a greater degree than, say, the US in circumstances where there's an opportunity for some degree of collaboration.
Okay. Next question, please, ma'am.
I'm Kishra Faulkner from the House of Lords. I wanted to pick up the point made by Stephen King about geopolitics. And at the Sir Douglas mentioned at the second Belt and Road Forum that President Xi set out his vision for where he wants to go, but you didn't mention, Sir Douglas, that one of the things that was quite concerning was this vision of China becoming a cyber superpower. Those are the exact words, a cyber superpower. And I wonder whether the panel, and particularly Stephen, whether you'd agree that the digital arena is where the next competitive framework will be, particularly between the US and China, and that talk about the UK being an honest broker or having any leverage at all is, frankly, we have a very, very light footprint. I think that's a diplomatic way to put it. So essentially in Europe, in the Western world, if I can broadly include Australia, New Zealand, Japan as well in that, in the Western world, there's going to be a choice that's got to be made. Because in the digital cyber arena, the security imperative is what becomes critical, as we're beginning to find out. And what do you think the UK will be doing there, looking beyond what's just happened in the last month?
Okay, so as the next front of tensions in the cyberspace between the US and China, and what role does the UK play?
Again, I'm an economist. I'm not a super forecaster or a cyber expert, so I have to sort of apologise for my lack of knowledge in this particular area. But I think what I've observed is this, that going back to the Bloomberg New Economy Forum with the speeches by Hank Paulson, one of the things he was specifically focused on was the idea that we could end up with like a technological wall that might eventually exist, that there'll be different systems in different parts of the world, but as one part of the world tries to protect itself against the other part of the world, will end up as, I mean, you recall a few years back, maybe a few decades ago, you went to Japan and you had to have a different kind of mobile phone because the mobile phone didn't operate in Japan in the way it operated in other parts of the world. That sort of thing might begin to reappear. And I'm going to drop a huge clangy name at this point because at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum, alongside Hank Paulson, there was Bill Gates. And Bill Gates was asked about this, and I think I trust him more than me in terms of knowledge of things electronic and computerized. And he said this is complete nonsense, that there's no way you can build a permanent wall between two different places, that eventually things would leak across one way or the other. And I guess the issue then is, well, if they do leak, you can't build that border or barrier. How do you then manage the flow of information and disinformation that comes along? But one thing I would note is this, and I fully accept that there are differences of attitude in terms of, let's say, social media in China compared with the West. But I think there was a belief a few years back, particularly amongst cyber utopians in the West, that somehow social media, the internet and so on will be providers of truth. And maybe at first they were, but they aren't providers of truth. They are ways of people reinforcing their existing beliefs and prejudices. And we've seen in recent times more and more of that sort of thing happening. So I don't think it's just a problem in terms of China versus the US. I think it's also a problem in terms of how we think about truth, belief, and the falsehoods are peddled across the internet more generally.
But Minister, I have to come to you. Obviously, technology is one of the areas of great tension between the US and China, and likely to play out over a long period of time. Is this an impediment for UK and other involvement in Belt and Road? Is this where the next trade war is going to be fought?
I think there are many aspects to this question. One thing is about connectivity. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is about a connectivity. So digital connectivity is one of the important areas of this project. That's why we say there is a so-called, we want to build a so-called digital Silk and Road. So we want the world to be connected up. Just imagine that for developing countries to have access to broadband, to digital technologies, it will bring immense opportunities for them. So Huawei is there to help, like including 5G. And the second thing is about security. Of course, China understands there is a legitimate concern over cybersecurity, over national security. Every country has that one. But what we oppose, what we don't like is to securitize everything. I mean, UK made a correct decision to continue to let Huawei to operate in the UK market. It's not that UK people are much smarter than the United States, than the US administration, but it's a matter of fact. Because UK is monitoring Huawei, it would be foolish for Huawei to install a backdoor while under the watch of the cybersecurity lab. I was told Huawei is essentially naked in the UK. Virtually you couldn't see anything they are doing. And of course they said they are ready to sign a no backdoor agreement. Has any other American company agreed to sign a no backdoor agreement with the UK? Maybe you trust them. Okay, maybe you trust them. But the third thing is about the technology competition between China and the United States. If the United States can become a technological leader in the world, why can't China? It's just our natural desire to catch up, to develop our latest technologies. Let's engage in a so-called healthy competition in terms of technology. United States could lead the world of 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G. Why should China lead the world in 5G? Maybe United States will lead the world in 6G. Who knows? Who knows? So let's have this competition. If the United States use all its national power to just suppress a company like Huawei, it's a little bit ridiculous. It's a little bit ridiculous.
As you say, that's a subject for a whole other debate.
Yeah.
Data technology,
Yeah.
how it's revolutionizing industry and societies, and data nationalism. We'll touch on that next conference, but that's a key issue. Marcus, I'll come to you, and then David.
Thank you. Actually, my question is kind of related to that. So within the planning, Marcus Treacher, Ripple, within the planning horizon of Belt and Road, the underlying technology of the global economy, whether it's through blockchain, artificial intelligence, etc., is likely to totally transform how we think about trade. So one, is there a risk you feel that if we play out with today's model of how trade works, we end up with a Belt and Road structure which is under effective in the mid-21st century? And related to that, how could the UK kind of leverage its big focus on tech and fintech to maybe take a more assertive role in helping shape what Belt and Road actually becomes, so it's really fit for purpose throughout the rest of the century and beyond?
Yeah, very good point. We're looking now beyond the immediate project, infrastructure project, the digital infrastructure and what role the UK can play. Again, did your research touch on that?
I'm not an IT specialist either, so I got to say I haven't really looked so much at the digital Silk Road, but I would say that the reason why we're discussing it is because there's also huge demand from the countries which sit along either the land road or the maritime road for the technology which China provides. And the issue that we also have is the governance systems in some of those countries mean that there's also an attractiveness to the Chinese model of technology to a certain extent. What role the UK can play in that, again, is leaning on its long-standing relations with certain regime types to influence decisions. And of course working with the Chinese government as well in terms of the technology which is rolled out as part of the digital Silk Road.
But Stephen, I think Mark is taking a longer view here, that you know, in 2050, 2060, trade will be very different than it is now, and should the UK not be, or can the UK play a role in framing that sort of digital future?
So I have given some thought to this, and I think the way I put it is as follows, that the late 20th century model of globalization was mostly about the forces of dispersion. In other words, it was capital moving to where labor was relatively cheap. It was the creation of incredibly complex supply chains. It was all about container shipping. It was lots of different ways of moving capital around the world to find where the labor was relatively cheap. That model, I think, is now under threat, partly because of technology. And it's under threat because you can now get a robot at home to do what a cheap worker might do somewhere else in the world, even more cheaply. And this is applying across a whole range of different areas. It's not just in terms of goods, it's a whole range of services too. So this actually takes you back to a different model of globalization, one that existed in the 19th century. The 19th century model of globalization was effectively a story of the agglomeration, the creation of capital within limited areas of the world through steam technology. So a lot of that happened in Europe, to the US to a certain degree, and at the same time, a huge amount of deglobalization in other parts of the world, as for example, Britain was embracing countries elsewhere in the world, to use your language. What you found was that, as an example, so China and India together accounted for over 60% or so of global manufacturing output in 1750. By 1900, their share had gone down to 5%. And it wasn't just because of the massive growth of manufacturing in Europe, it was also because these countries found that they were no longer competitive in manufacturing, prices of manufacturing goods were collapsing, and they went back into rural poverty in many ways. Now, the connection here is that if in the future countries no longer can belong to those global supply chains because the global supply chains are shortened because of robotics and AI, you then come back to Douglas's point about the possibility that there are huge swathes of people in different parts of the world who don't have access to capital, who are in danger of being condemned to poverty, and they will move. And you'll end up with much more in the way of movement of people to places that are richer, but places that may not want those people. So to that extent, Belt and Road, I think, does create a possibility for connections to be made that are lasting and which actually create a permanent opportunity for people who would otherwise be impoverished to be better off. And that might deal to a certain degree with the migration threat that would otherwise exist. But I think your point is really important, that the AI robotics revolution threatens to change the way we think about trading patterns in the future.
And that emphasises my point about building into this whole network the development of skills and capabilities everywhere, and not just having it specialised in a few places, which could lead to what you were suggesting could happen. Okay. So that skills thread is important.
David Taylor.
David Sayer, Vice Chair, KPMG. And what really strikes me is infrastructure really works if you look at the big picture. And the biggest picture of all is the economic miracle that China has achieved in lifting 1 billion people out of poverty through infrastructure-led growth in only the last 35 years. It is possibly the greatest economic miracle in history. And the opportunity we now face for the next 35 years is replicating what China has done for the people across the Belt and Road countries. The difficulty with infrastructure from my perspective, and we've had these debates, most of this debate is very similar to the discussion we had when we started the EFD discussions on Belt and Road under James' leadership, and then the subsequent ones last year under Douglas's leadership. When you look at something like the Channel Tunnel, you end up with loss-making railway lines. However, for the economy as a whole, almost certainly a very good thing. Great Western Railway was almost certainly loss-making for its shareholders, but created economic value in Swindon. And it seems to me that what the UK can really do, in cooperation absolutely with China, and the value the UK can bring, is building funding capacity for Belt and Road by looking at a big enough picture so that you don't just look at the railway line or the other elements of infrastructure. You look at the value you create in terms of property values, the value you create in terms of logistics centres, the value you create in terms of economic growth, and you create viable bonds that are sustainable in economic terms and in climate change terms, and the two come together. This has got to be a green investment asset class, because without that, you will never be able to sell those bonds on to the next generation of millennials.
Steve, is this an economic model you're looking at?
Yes. I'll add one more thing to that, actually, which is that, and again, Douglas referred to this in his speech, there's a lack of investment taking place around the world. The volumes of investment are very, very low. And yet borrowing costs are equally remarkably low. Now, there's obviously in one sense, a traditional fear of being excessively indebted, and there are lots of dangers associated with being excessively indebted, as I described earlier on with the experience of Greece or Spain or whatever. But at the same time, I think there's a legitimate question today as to how much additional finance could be raised precisely because interest rates are so low, and precisely because the private sector, particularly in the West, is so unwilling to invest. So in my view, there is an opportunity, given the low cost of borrowing, to think about, if you like, some of the social benefits that come from these kinds of investments, and try to work out a way of ensuring that if there's private money raised, it has to be private money that the investors themselves can feel confident they will get a return on in the future. And just to make this incredibly local story, one of the big questions about the UK going towards electric cars or petrol cars by 2035 is not the cars themselves. That's the easy part. The difficult part is working out how to fund the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And a lot of investors would probably think, well, okay, once I've invested in the charging infrastructure up and down the country, then the regulator's going to come along and say, well, you can't charge more than this for filling up a tank of battery, so to speak. As a consequence, I can't earn decent returns. So I think that issue of low borrowing costs, how you ensure returns come back to the investors, that's a critical question.
Mr. Barr?
Well, I think well said. Mr. Seah has made a very good, important point. I wonder if in economics there is a model to evaluate value like a railway line. It must be very difficult. But I understand there is huge, what we call positive externality to building a rail line. I mean, in this aspect, obviously China wanted to replicate our experience because we in China always say, if you want to become rich, build roads, certain roads, highways, expressways, railways, including aviation links, all helped a lot. So we hope if it's good for China, it might also be good for other developing countries. They desperately need infrastructure. But of course, the recipient country, the host country, have to also think about it carefully, whether they need that or not, whether that dovetail with their national strategies. Then Kenya, we didn't build a high-speed railway for Kenya. It's a railway of 120 kilometers, but it's 3 times the line that the UK had built. You had built a railway just along the new railway. It was 40 kilometers. So we think 40 kilometers is too slow, but 100 kilometers is good enough for Kenya at this stage. So they don't quite need a 350 kilometer high-speed railway. So there are many conditions that we have to think about. And if we want to help build infrastructure, actually there is a long-term perspective. So we need the contribution from the host government and also the contribution from other sovereign governments like the UK, maybe other multinational development banks, to help this country, to put this country on the long-term footing, not only for quick money, because investors usually go for quick money, but investment in infrastructure could also provide some return, but also it is good for the longer-term development of developing countries.
I mean, this comes back to the issue of how you finance it, because in China's case, it's pretty straightforward. The infrastructure led to much faster growth. Much faster growth means much higher tax revenue, so the ability to repay the existing debts or the original debts is quite high. The tricky thing economically is if you have a country where you put in lots of infrastructure, you don't discover immediately there's much of a faster growth rate. Then you've got a problem. And actually Spain's quite a good example of this. I remember going to Spain, I think just after the global financial crisis, and saying, well, what you need to do is to build more infrastructure. And the person said to me, we've got stacks of it already. We built airports next to each other. We can't even fly to each other because we can drive more quickly. So in Spain's case, one of the problems was they had plenty of infrastructure, but the growth rate never picked up in the way that it did in China. So you didn't get the tax revenue benefits coming through. So the connection between infrastructure investment and growth is one that's it's worked perfectly in China's case, but I think it's slightly more tenuous in the case of other countries.
Okay. Final question, because we're just about out of time. I'm sorry. Okay, Richard, we'll come to you.
Thank you, Richard Lillison from Gas Asia. Very interested in the panel debate, and just a general observation, really. In '66, Willy Brandt decided that, he said that basically if the First World wished to maintain its wealth and prosperity growth, it must develop the Third World. And I think what the BRI does, in fact, is go some way to develop the infrastructure that will deliver those goods. But there's one overriding issue here, which is as we develop the Third World, we bring better prosperity. We also bring a whole new of global issues, such as the environment. without the green agenda being top and centre of this, the politics, the commerce, the initiatives will be overtaken by the impairment costs of what climate change will do. And I'm just wondering if, going back to this idea, the UK may have an important part in the framework of how we actually deliver the framework that delivers the prosperity and the long-term funding, how the UK government and how in particular the accounting institutions centre themselves to take advantage of what has to happen.
In fact, Douglas, do you mind if I throw that one to you? What role does the UK play? Richard makes the point that growth is wonderful, but the potential is for some of this growth in the developing world to have a climate change cost which future generations will have to pay. Does the UK government have a lead role to play in the whole climate aspect of Belt and Road?
Yes, I do, but as part of a global community, I mean, it's... I absolutely agree with what you say, and then at the same time, but you can't have a world that says we have got to a stage where we have 2 motor cars per family, 3 refrigerators, 4 televisions, that's fine, but you can't have a light bulb. I mean, that kind of world, that global inequality will end up in the migration and the kind of failed states and the consequences of that we would, I think, all want to work very hard to avoid. So the question is, how do you share the carbon footprint of the world? I mean, I think it's that challenge and how do you share the data footprint of the world are the 2 challenges that there aren't international fora that have got the power to direct. And of course, like climate change, like data, the wealthy parts of the world have a superior advantage at the moment. They've already got to a level. Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest challenge actually is agriculture, because to feed the emerging middle classes, when people want more protein, which means growing more grain, which means taking more land away for the production of taking trees down to build more wheat fields or whatever. I mean, there is a massive challenge, which is a global challenge, and I don't know what the framework is for nations to agree how they see. I mean, there's that wonderful. I'll stop in a minute. There was that wonderful article in the Sunday papers 2 weekends ago where the students challenged the bursar of an Oxford college as to why he had investments in fossil fuel companies. And he said, I can't change that immediately, but I can switch off the heating in your dorm.
Yeah.
and kind of people have to recognize that those of us that are lucky enough in the world to have a very sophisticated way of life are going to have to adjust in ways that I don't think society is yet ready to recognize. And we saw that in France, where Macron put a couple of cents on gasoline, and the Gilets jaunes said that was too far, even though they embrace environmental protection and climate change. Yeah. I think it's an extraordinary problem. But how do you say to countries, you can't develop? I mean, that's why I think Belt and Road is hugely powerful in helping them develop in a way that would be more sustainable than they might otherwise do, or avoid the economic poverty that will lead to migration and war.
Okay. Thank you very much. On that note, I'm afraid we have to leave it. Just remains for me to thank our speakers, Ben Barton, Minister Maway from the Embassy, Dame Mary Marsh, and of course Stephen King, and of course Sir Douglas Flint, who not only made a speech but joined into the conversation as well afterwards. Thank you all very much for being here. Do have a very good day. See you soon.